we can go ahead and get started. In case you don't know me, my name's Anna Withers, and I'm the Farmer and Resource Development Manager for Springfield Community Gardens. We are a nonprofit based in Springfield, Missouri, whose vision is a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. Right now, we operate 17 community gardens, 3 urban farms, a commercial test kitchen, and community food forest in the Ozarks. And this workshop on produce food safety is generously funded by the Missouri Department of Agriculture's Specialty Crops Block Grant Program. So thank you, MOAG. And we're joined tonight once again by our good friend Patrick Byers. He is the horticulture and food safety specialist with the University of Missouri Extension. And just real quick before we get started, try to help us keep track of questions throughout the night by using the Q&A if you would like us to answer a question that you have, and then put anything else that you'd like to in the chat. And I'm about to put some links into the chat as well, more places where you can find us, as well as a link to Patrick's workshop evaluation. And that'll also pop up at the end of this webinar. So feel free to wait until then. And we have, Springfield Community Gardens has a pretty extensive YouTube library of agricultural workshop playlists. So definitely check us out there. Take time in the winter to brush up on some of your knowledge, whether it's on produce food safety or tree grafting or composting, business planning. We've got a ton of different recordings that are really helpful to people. So without further ado, I will go ahead and hand it off to Patrick.
Oh, thank you so much, Anna. I'm very pleased to be with everyone tonight. As Anna mentioned, I'm a horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension. I'm based here in Southwest Missouri. And about 5 years ago, I was given the opportunity to join the Missouri-Kansas Produce Food Safety Team. So that gave me, again, a unique opportunity to retrain in a very exciting area. And that kind of brings us to our subject matter for this evening, which is produce food safety. And we'll be spending roughly 50 minutes or so talking about some of the aspects of produce food safety. Now, obviously, produce food safety is a much larger topic than 50 minutes. But what I have chosen to do is to pick out some, again, some important points that will hopefully stimulate conversation. And we will be happy to take questions from the folks in the attendance, and please enter those into the Q&A, and Anna will keep an eye on those, and we'll tackle those at the end. We'll also have a chance to unmute and ask questions in person. And I will mention too that tonight is just meant to start the conversation, and anyone who is involved in growing produce really needs to be focused in on making sure that produce is as safe as possible for those of us like Anna and myself who eat fresh produce. And so hopefully tonight's conversation will start a deeper conversation in produce food safety. And I will share with you a couple of opportunities to deepen that knowledge base at the end of my presentation. So let's go ahead and get started with our topic for tonight. Okay, Anna, can we see the presentation? Anna, can we get a quick check to make sure the presentation's looking good?
I was muted. I'm sorry. Yes.
Oh, no
All looks
problem.
good.
Okay, very good. All right. Again, as mentioned, I'm Patrick Byers with University of Missouri Extension. And here is what I did, certainly, as Anna mentioned, our workshop this evening is supported by the Missouri Department of Agriculture, and I want to definitely acknowledge the partnership that I have been blessed to join with Springfield Community Gardens over the past several years. And again, as Anna mentioned, Springfield Community Gardens has a vision of a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. And University of Missouri Extension shares that same goal and mission. So again, it's a great partnership, and I'm glad to be a partner with Springfield Community Gardens on our workshops. So here is what we're going to talk about this evening. This is a series of bullet points. We'll expand upon them, but as I said at the beginning, I hope that there's some discussion to further develop these. And again, this is a starting point for what I hope to be a more in-depth discussion of produce food safety in the future. So first of all, we'll talk about why we should be thinking about produce food safety, which, is probably obvious, but still deserves to be mentioned. We'll talk a bit about what it is on produce that can make people ill. And then we'll talk about things that we as farmers and food handlers can do to minimize the risk of foodborne illnesses. We'll talk about site selection, hygiene and health, water and irrigation, soil manure and compost, animals in the garden or the field, and harvest and post-harvest concerns. So I have some action items. First of all, as Anna mentioned, there'll be a link to an evaluation. I ask that you fill that out. Those evaluations are extremely valuable for me as an educator so that I can continually improve my presentations. They also give us feedback that is important to our funders. Our funders want to know that the money that they have provided to support our programming is reaching an audience and that it's effective. I'm also asking that you visit the Produce Safety Alliance website. This is a storehouse of useful information related to produce food safety. And so please take a moment to visit that. If you're involved with a community garden, the North Carolina State University Community Garden Food Safety website is an excellent collection of resources as well. I'll tell you more about the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Alliance training, the FSMA PSA trainings that are coming up at the end of the presentation. And then again, please reach out if you have any questions regarding food safety. I'm happy to work with people individually on the issues that are on their farms. And again, with the common goal of growing and handling produce so that it is safe for the people who are going to be consuming it. Okay, so to start off the discussion, why should we be concerned about produce food safety? Well, first of all, we have to think about the burden of foodborne illness. And the reality is that 1 out of 4 Americans will be afflicted with a foodborne illness each year. I myself can testify I had 2 bouts of foodborne illness last year, and it was not pleasant. These illnesses result in 76 million illnesses nationwide, 325,000 hospitalizations, and unfortunately, over 5,000 deaths annually. Again, these are deaths related to foodborne illness. It's related to contaminants or microorganisms that are on produce that we consume. So it is certainly an issue. And of course, those of us who follow produce food safety in the news, we recognize that there are repeated outbreaks of foodborne illness related to the consumption of fresh produce. Now, does this mean we shouldn't be consuming fresh produce? Of course not. Fresh produce is an important part of a healthy diet, and eating fresh produce is just plain enjoyable. Who doesn't like having a fresh salad or a bowl of strawberries, or again, any of these produce items that we enjoy eating fresh? But we have to recognize that if produce doesn't go through a kill step, if it isn't somehow rendered biologically safe, there is risk. And that what we do as farmers in handling and growing crops is critically important to make sure that the produce that all of us are consuming fresh is as safe as possible. Now, just to get a feel for produce-related outbreaks, these are data from the Food and Drug Administration records from 1996 to 2014. And if we look at that pie chart, we can notice that there are 2 items, sprouts and leafy greens, that are responsible for nearly half of foodborne illnesses. And that's recognized. Again, in recent years, we've seen foodborne illness outbreaks related to things such as romaine lettuce and other types of lettuce. But notice the rest of the pie chart. There's about a quarter of that pie that is made up of berries, tomatoes, and melons. There was recently a foodborne illness outbreak traced back to cantaloupe. But again, these are items of produce that have been implicated in foodborne illnesses. And then that final quarter of the pie, a number of different produce items. And again, the whole point of this particular slide is to point out that there are a number of produce items that have been implicated in foodborne illness outbreaks. Another point that should be made, if we notice the 5% of the pie that is unknown, foodborne illness outbreaks in some cases cannot be traced back to specific types of produce. We know that an outbreak was related to produce, but it can be very difficult or impossible in some cases to find the particular produce that was implicated. And we have to recognize too that the symptoms of foodborne illness mimic the symptoms of many other illnesses. And so the reality is the foodborne illness is underreported in the United States. Now, at-risk produce. Uh, the produce that we eat fresh without cooking is the produce that is risky. Now, I think back to my mom when I was a child, and she cooked just about everything that went through her kitchen, and no one, I think, ever was afflicted with foodborne illness after eating one of my mom's meals. They were delicious, but they were well cooked. But the reality is that we like to eat fresh produce. We like to eat produce that has not gone through a step that renders it biologically safe. And then we have to recognize that there are a number of produce items that are grown in close proximity to the soil. And as we'll see here in a moment, the soil and contaminants in the soil can frequently cause problems. So things such as greens, spinach, root veggies, strawberries, and summer squash, all produce items that are close to the soil are those produce items that are more at risk. Now, can't we just wash the produce? Is washing produce a good idea? Well, yes, it is. But the reality is that once produce is contaminated, once it's been contaminated, particularly with biological contaminants, it's very difficult or even impossible to clean up that produce. There are produce items that have natural openings, that have rough surfaces, tears in produce items, bruising. All of these things provide entry points and make contaminants, once they're lodged on the produce, very difficult to dislodge. And so the better approach from the standpoint of reducing risk is to prevent contamination. Okay, so again, certainly we can wash produce, but that is not going to wash away the problem. Now, where does contamination with biological pathogens occur? Well, it can happen anywhere between the field and the fork, or as this slide says, the garden to the fork. Certainly can happen in the garden or on the farm in the ways that we grow produce and particularly as we handle issues related to the soil and organic amendments. It can happen during harvesting and handling. Frequently, issues here, as we'll see in a moment, are related to health and hygiene, or perhaps to cross-contamination on food contact surfaces. It can also happen in distribution and sharing as we take produce items and move them off of the farm and move them towards consumers. Contamination can occur. And contamination, of course, can occur in the home. And it's important that we as consumers recognize that we should be handling produce safely at home. But for tonight's purposes, we're going to focus on the first three bullets in the garden or on the farm, during harvesting and handling, and in distribution and sharing. Now, I always like to include some information on community gardens or urban farms because frequently in our audiences with Springfield Community Gardens workshops, we have people involved in these settings. And I will say that we have food safety trainings that are specifically targeting community gardens. But I did want to mention a couple of issues related to community gardens or urban farms that we need to consider when we think about produce food safety. First of all, there's lots of people involved in a community garden or an urban farm. There's certainly the leadership. There may be volunteers involved. There may be plot holders in the case of community gardens. And frequently, particularly with community gardens, these are in public settings where the community at large can visit and enjoy the garden. But every person that is present in a garden or on a farm that might contact produce does carry some degree of risk. So the more people involved, the more risk involved. Frequently, animals have free access to gardens or to urban farms, and these could be wild animals. There are a number of wild animals that are frequently found in urban settings. They could be domestic animals or pets. In some cases, we have limited control over activities in the garden or on the farm. And this, again, is particularly the case in community gardens. Most community gardens want the community to visit the garden. But once people are invited on, there's just limited things that community garden leadership can do to control those activities. And then there may be some unknowns, particularly in urban settings. Frequently, we're repurposing land that was used for other purposes in the past. And sometimes these previous land uses carry some risk. And then in an urban setting, there's neighbors, and activities from neighbors can cause problems as well. So these are all important things to recognize. And if you are involved with a community garden and want to learn more about managing the risks that are inherent in a community garden setting, the North Carolina Community Garden website that I mentioned at the beginning is an excellent resource, and I urge you to visit that website. Okay, so to continue the discussion of why we should be concerned, what are some of the things that we can do? Well, that's what the rest of our time together tonight is going to be about. But basically, we're looking at what are called good agricultural practices. And these are things that we can do as farmers and food handlers, first of all, to reduce the risk of microbial contamination to food and to ensure that the produce that we're growing is safe for gardeners, safe for customers, and anyone else that we may share that produce with. And then using these good agricultural practices will help protect us in the event of an outbreak. If there is an outbreak, hopefully our practices will minimize the impact of that outbreak. And then the goal, of course, is a food safety culture, which is a set of shared attitudes, values, and beliefs around food safety. In the case of community garden, that's part of the community in a community or school garden. In the case of a farm, that's part of the trust that is placed in farmers by consumers. So it's important that all of us involved in produce develop this food safety culture. Okay, now let's talk about the contaminants. What is it that can make people sick after consuming fresh produce? Well, first of all, we have biological contaminants, and these are organisms. These are living organisms. They fall into one of three groups: bacteria, viruses, or parasites. Now, the vast majority of foodborne illnesses have been traced back to bacterial contamination. So, a lot of our focus in produce food safety is in minimizing bacterial contamination. What can we do to minimize the presence of harmful bacteria on produce? And you know the culprits. You've seen these names: E. coli, O157H7, hepatitis A, that's a virus, Listeria monocytogenes, norovirus, another virus, Salmonella, Shigella, these are bacteria, Cyclospora, which is a parasite. These are some of the biological contaminants that have been implicated in foodborne illness outbreaks in the past, and they will continue to be problems. We have to be eternally vigilant against these contaminants. Now, how do these contaminants get on food? Well, typically it's one of three ways. First of all, it's contact between feces or poop from an animal or a person to the produce. Okay, this could be in the case of direct contact with animals or people, or it could be in the case of manure that can carry these contaminants. These contaminants can also come from people working with produce that are ill, and we'll talk more about that here in a moment as well. And these contaminants can come from water that has been contaminated by human activity or the presence of animals. So again, poop, sick people, or contaminated water. These are the three primary ways the biological contaminants get onto produce. Now, there are non-biological contaminants that we need to be aware of, and I'll say a few things about this, but most of our time together tonight is going to be focused on biological contaminants, but particularly in urban settings in community gardens, school gardens, or urban farms, non-biological contaminants can be a serious issue. First of all, heavy metal contamination, especially lead and arsenic. In a number of cases here recently, I've been involved in evaluating urban sites for heavy metal contamination. So it's important to do a soil test, as we'll see here in a moment, to evaluate the presence of heavy metals. Petroleum distillates, things such as gasoline, oil, tar, other petroleum-based contaminants can be found in soils as well. Residues of pesticides and fertilizers can cause problems. Physical contaminants, things such as pieces of glass, metal shards, trash, anything else that could be physically present that might contaminate produce could be a problem. And then there's that other category of other, and a number of things could fall into this category here. Okay, now let's move on to site selection. Let's talk a little bit about evaluating the presence or the possible presence of contaminants at a site before we start farming that site. Now, particularly again in urban or suburban settings, in community gardens, urban farms, try to find out as much as you can about the history of the site, because the history of the site can be very helpful in understanding any risks that might be present. This is a picture of a community garden site in Jasper County in deep southwest Missouri. And just looking at it, all looks well. But the reality is that this is a site with problems, okay? And the reason that there's problems here is if we understand the history of this is a site that was close to lead mining activities in Jasper County in the 18th and 19th, or not, the 19th and 20th centuries. And in fact, there was enough residue from these lead mining activities that there can be contamination present in many sites in Jasper and neighboring counties. And this particular site, upon testing, did have some elevated levels of lead. So again, understanding that this was a part of Missouri where there was a strong possibility of lead contamination led us towards testing this site for the presence of lead in the soil. You can also understand uh, uh, some of the possibilities at a site by just walking over it, looking for things such as the risk of flooding, the use of the site by animals. Was that site used? Was it a construction site? Was it a site where there could be petroleum contamination? Again, all of these things can be understood by understanding the history of a site. Now, how do we find the history of the site? Sometimes it's a bit challenging. If possible, try to talk to previous owners. Planning officials with cities, towns, and counties can be helpful. Oftentimes, just checking with the community. Start with the cooperative extension agents that are based in that county or other community members. And then, of course, visiting the site and evaluating potential risks. That's critically important as well. Now, from the standpoint of heavy metals, it's always a good idea to do a soil test and request a heavy metals test. The University of Missouri Soil Testing Laboratory can conduct this test. The testing fee is reasonable. It's $50 plus a setup fee of $25, and a range of metals are tested for. These include arsenic, cadmium, cobalt, chromium, molybdenum, nickel, lead, and selenium. And again, these are all potential contaminants. Here in Missouri, arsenic and lead tend to be the most commonly found contaminants in the soil. Recognize that with many soils, there is a background level of some of these heavy metals, but as we'll see here in the next slide, the test report can be very revelatory when it comes to risk related to heavy metals. And here's an example. These were two community garden sites that were tested for heavy metals. And if we look at this test here, first of all, the third line down that says background, this is what would be the expected background levels of various heavy metals found in soils in Missouri. And if we look at lead, which is PB, it's the next to the last column on the right. First of all, there is no background level of lead. It typically is not found in the soil. If we look at arsenic, the second column, notice the background level is 3 to 12 milligrams per kilogram of soil. Now, what did the soil test show us? In the case of arsenic, we were still below background levels. So there's no risk or at least a minimal risk from arsenic contamination of that site. Let's look at lead. These sites both had fairly high levels of lead. In the case of the first garden, 430 milligrams per kilogram of lead. The second test, 546 milligrams per kilogram of lead. Well, we use the EPA recommended standards from the standpoint of the risk associated with heavy metal levels in the soil. And the EPA has declared that 400 milligrams per kilogram is a level to be concerned about, that and above. And in both of these tests, we noticed that the levels were above that maximum level recommended by the EPA. Thankfully, none of the other, well, with the exception of cadmium, the levels of cadmium were elevated, and so were the levels of chromium. The levels of cadmium and chromium. In fact, all the rest of them were below the EPA recommended maximum amounts. So at this site, we were focused on lead. Well, what does 430 or 546 milligrams of lead mean from the standpoint of using that site as a community garden? Well, if we look down at the footnote, these are recommendations that have been developed from several different university extension sites related to lead levels and the use of those sites. In the case of our sites, 430, 546, we can see that levels of 400 to 1,000 follow best management practices to minimize lead exposure and do not grow leafy greens. Well, what are the best management practices to minimize lead exposure? Well, it's an effort to separate soil from produce and also soil from people in the garden. And this can be done in a number of ways, perhaps using weed barrier fabric over the soil, perhaps using a thick layer of mulch. It doesn't mean that the site cannot be used for general produce growth, but we don't want to use it for leafy greens, and we want to take precautions to make sure that we don't expose people who are consuming the produce and the people working in the garden or on the farm to unsafe levels of lead. Some other things we can do to lower the safety risk. First of all, let's store all pesticides and fertilizers in a secure fashion. And of course, this is especially important if children are present, but we want to keep potential contaminants away from produce. That includes pesticides and fertilizers. Make sure that we use pesticides and fertilizers only as indicated on their labels. Make sure, again, that we follow all label requirements and that we wear protective equipment if needed to keep ourselves safe when we're applying these materials. Okay, hygiene and health. This is the next thing we're going to talk about. And how do, I mean, the reality is that people are going to contact produce. And we touch produce when we're growing it. We touch it when we harvest it and handle it. We touch it when we distribute it. Of course, we also touch it when we eat it. But we want to recognize the importance of proper hygiene and health practices to minimize foodborne illness. Now, I'm sure all of us have probably heard thousands of messages related to hand washing, and particularly since the pandemic was upon us, we recognize that hand washing is important. But how important is hand washing? Well, this is a clipping from a Denver newspaper, and this is from a number of years ago. You can see it's dated 1992, but it really points out the importance of hand washing. And in this case, a hepatitis A outbreak in Denver was traced back to a single person working in a food establishment. And this person did not have good hygiene practices, and they were ill. They continued to work in this setting, and they were shedding the virus. And it's estimated that over 15,000 people were exposed to hepatitis in this particular case. And again, you know, perhaps well, and I'm sure there was a risk just related to the fact that the person was ill, but the fact that this person did not have good hand washing habits furthered the problem, made the problem much more severe. And in fact, there's a few, it's kind of hard to read, but there's a section there where it's talking about ways to protect from transmission of hepatitis. And the best way to guard against it is washing your hands after using the bathroom or changing diapers. So again, a single person with poor hand washing habits can certainly lead to a serious issue. Now, how important is hand washing? At least half of foodborne illnesses are related to poor hand washing. Now, when should you wash your hands? Well, again, I'm sure we all have ideas on this. Here are some guidelines, but you should wash your hands anytime there is a risk of contamination. Certainly after using the toilet, before and after treating a cut or wound, after smoking, eating, or drinking, after handling compost, after handling garbage or plant debris, after caring for or touching animals, before you handle produce, and after engaging in activities that soil your hands. So again, whenever there's a risk of contamination, your hands should be washed. Now, how do you wash your hands? Well, first, let's set the stage. You need to have potable running water. Water must be drinking water quality to do a good job of washing your hands. If you wash your hands with dirty water, you're really not solving the issue. There should be soap present. You need to have soap to break up any sort of films on your hands and to move away contaminants, particularly bacteria, from your hands during the hand washing process. And then single-use towels in a trash can. Once you've rinsed your hands, a single-use towel will then remove any contamination that might be remaining, and then throwing that contaminated towel into a trash can. Now, obviously, it's nice if we have a properly plumbed hand washing station where it's convenient and easy, but we can develop hand washing stations anywhere, in any setting. These could be portable ones like we see in the upper picture here, or they could be homemade ones like we see in the lower picture. But as long as you have potable running water, a way to dispense soap onto your hands, the ability to wash and lather your hands, and then have the water drain away, the water and soap drain away, and then single-use towels and a trash can. That's really all you need. And I'm sure all of us can come up with creative ways to meet these requirements. Now, do we really know how to wash our hands? I'm sure all of us could report back on how long we should be washing our hands. We've all heard that you should be washing your hands for at least 20 seconds. Now, remember 20 seconds is a minimum period of time. It's not the maximum period of time. And so 20 seconds at least. But here are the steps. Wet your hands with warm water, apply soap to your hands, lather hands briskly for 20 seconds. Areas to concentrate on. Look at this picture here. Any place you see red, these are parts of your hand that are missed. And notice your thumbs. I have watched many people wash their hands in the course of my job as a produce food safety specialist. And almost invariably, some of these areas are missed. So thumbs are commonly missed. The fingernails are commonly missed. The area between your thumb and your forefinger is commonly missed. Your wrists need to be washed as well. So looking at these steps, we want to wash palm to palm, palm on backs of hands, claw paws in palms, between fingers, scrub forearm near wrists, left and right hands. Frequently, our dominant hand isn't washed as well as our less dominant hand because we're using our dominant hand on our less dominant hand. So make sure that both left and right hands are washed. Then we rinse thoroughly and we towel dry with a disposable paper towel. And remember, 20 seconds is minimum. What about hand sanitizers? We see hand sanitizer dispensers in many, many places. Well, studies have shown that hand sanitizer is not a substitute for hand washing. Hands must be clean before we use a sanitizer. Well, what's the benefit of using a sanitizer on a clean hand? Well, there could be a few residual bacteria or other organisms present, even if we've done a good job of cleaning our hands. So sanitizing is an added step that can again get us that much closer to our goal, but it is definitely not a substitute for hand washing. Are gloves a substitute for hand washing? Of course not. Hands must be washed before we put on gloves. And we have to recognize that gloves are easily contaminated. Gloves frequently give us a false sense of security. So gloves should be replaced anytime they have become contaminated. Again, perhaps because I work in produce food safety, I've become somewhat sensitized to watching people who are wearing gloves. And almost invariably, over the course of watching people for less than a minute, I see at least one instance of contamination of gloves. And it can be something as simple as pulling out your cell phone or leaning on a counter with gloved hands or scratching your ear with gloved hands. Try to use gloves for only one task. Remember, your hands should be dry before putting on gloves. And then when you take the gloves off, wash your hands again. Now, bathroom habits. Obviously, we don't want to defecate or urinate in the field or garden. This is kind of a cute picture, but things like this do happen. And always important to use bathrooms. Whenever possible, try to use a bathroom that's connected with a sanitary waste disposal system of some sort. This could be a portable bathroom unit that is pumped. It could be a bathroom that's connected with a sewer or a septic system, but keep in mind that we don't want human waste to become a source of contamination. So bathrooms need to be properly connected to sanitary waste disposal facilities. Make sure that you wash your hands after using the bathroom and make sure that bathrooms are kept clean. Frequently when I'm on farm, again, perhaps because I work in produce food safety, I like to peek inside porta potties. And in most cases, when I peek inside the porta potty, it's been well maintained, it's cleaned, it doesn't smell. But my goodness, if there are problems, make sure that that porta potty or any bathroom facility is properly maintained and kept clean so that people are comfortable using it. And then, of course, wash your hands after using the bathroom. Okay, some thoughts on illness and produce. So again, as we saw at that opening slide under health and hygiene, people who are sick can certainly cause problems from the standpoint of foodborne illness. So if you're ill, don't work with produce. So what does ill mean? Well, coughing or sneezing, running a fever, any bodily discharge, and I should add too, yellowing of the eyes. That's an indication of jaundice, which can be a symptom of hepatitis. And so if you're ill, you should not be working with produce, particularly if you're exhibiting any of these symptoms. Now, when can an ill person return to handling produce? Well, the guideline is 24 hours symptom free. And so from the standpoint of, moving back into handling produce, make sure you feel good, make sure that you haven't been exhibiting symptoms for at least 24 hours. Cross-contamination. So again, cross-contamination, we'll talk more about this when we start talking about harvest. But cross-contamination is the transfer of harmful substances or disease-causing microorganisms to food, utensils, food contact surfaces, equipment, and clean surfaces. The majority of foodborne illness that's traced back to the home and handling produce in the home is because of cross-contamination. But this can be a problem on the farm as well. So we always want to be thinking about what we can do to prevent things such as the tools we use when we farm, the surfaces that we place produce on, coolers, vehicles that we use to transport produce, anything that's going to contact produce, and making sure that we don't accidentally transfer uh, these problems to these surfaces. Okay, so lowering the safety risk relative to health and hygiene. Best practice is to wash your hands, again, as mentioned, with soap, clean running water, dry using single-use towels. You can wear gloves, but make sure that they stay clean. If it's a task, if a task is maintenance only where we're not contacting produce, traditional gardening gloves are just fine. Make sure that you use bathrooms, don't defecate or urinate on the farm or in the field. If you are sick, don't work with produce. Okay, Anna, I think at this point, I'm going to take a pause to rest my voice for a moment and ask if there are any questions that have been entered.
Yes, please, everyone, definitely feel free to ask questions as we go. We had a couple comments about definitely not growing root crops in soils with elevated lead levels, which is important. And I did enter the links for both of our workshops on the topic. But yeah, right now we don't have any questions, Patrick.
Okay, well, let's continue on then. And our next topic is water and irrigation. And if you remember at the beginning of the workshop, we mentioned that contaminated water has been uh, a serious root from the standpoint of contaminating produce. So we'll spend a little time talking about water and irrigation. Again, sources of contamination. Actually, number one is water. This is ahead of animals and soil amendments and health and hygiene. Contaminated water has been implicated in a number of foodborne illness outbreaks. And anytime that water comes into contact with fresh produce, the quality of that water becomes paramount. Again, if there's issues with the quality, if the water is carrying pathogens, it can lead to problems because water can be a carrier of many different types of microorganisms, and it can very effectively take a small problem and spread it widely across the farm. So we have to be very conscious of the risk that is associated with water. Now, does this mean we can't use water on the farm? Of course not. We have to use water from the standpoint of producing produce and from the standpoint of handling produce at harvest and post-harvest. But we have to be very aware of the quality of that water and how we use it. The first thing to think about is where does the water come from? And there are varying levels of risk associated with different water sources. The safest water is public water. This is water that is coming from an authority such as a county, a water district, a municipality. This water authority or municipality is testing the water frequently, and in many cases, they're treating the water so that it is safe and so that it meets potability standards. So this is the safest water. What about groundwater? What about water coming from a well? Well, this would be next in the spectrum of safety. It is possible for groundwater to be contaminated, so we can't assume that it is safe, that it is potable, but we do need to test it. And if testing shows that it is safe, great. If testing shows that there's a problem, we need to figure out what that problem is and address the issue before we use that water for produce. Surface water, so water that's coming from a stream, a lake, a pond, water that we've collected off of an open surface, all of these sources will be carrying some level of contamination. And so surface water carries a higher risk than groundwater or public water supplies. So again, understanding the water source, this is very important when we're planting a farm or a garden. We want to know the safety of that water source. If we're using municipal water, we can request test reports. If we're using a well, we can test that well. Now, what about unregulated sources? Again, rivers, streams, irrigation, ditches, ponds, surface water. We have to assume that that is carrying some level of contamination because in almost every case, when these sources are tested, they are carrying bacteria, viruses, or parasites. And so it's important to test these to see what the level of contamination is. But the reality is, particularly as we approach harvest, we want our water to be as clean as possible. And it's best to use a municipal or a tested source or to use a well source that has been tested. As I mentioned, collected rainwater in rain barrels, collected off of surfaces will carry contamination as well. So recognize that that water cannot be assumed to be clean. Another thing to consider is how we're using that water. And if we think about irrigation, this is one of the primary uses for water on the farm. If we can figure out how to irrigate our crops in such a way that we don't contact the part of the crop we're going to harvest with the water, this is going to be helpful in managing risk. And so let's think about the common ways the crops are irrigated. First of all, overhead watering with a sprinkler. We can see that in the upper picture. In this case, we're throwing water over the crop. It's unavoidable that the part we're going to harvest is going to be contacted by the irrigation water. So this carries a fairly high risk if there's any problem with that water. What about flood or surface or furrow irrigation? Well, this is safer. We don't intentionally plan to contact the harvested part of the crop unless we're growing something like a root vegetable, but particularly those crops that are close to the ground, things such as leafy greens, some berries, melons, those sorts of things, there can certainly be splash from a flood, surface, or furrow irrigation system. The safest way to irrigate crops is through drip, through trickle, subsurface, micro irrigation, or under canopy irrigation. Lower risk because the produce typically does not contact the irrigation water. Again, the exception would be something like root crops. Now, we can make it even safer if we place the drip or trickle underneath a mulch layer. Again, another barrier between the part of the crop we're going to harvest and the irrigation water. So in terms of risk, overhead carries the highest level of risk, and drip or trickle carries the lowest level of risk. So again, less contact with water equals lower risk. So when we're thinking about the risk associated with water, is the water applied using a direct water application method? If we can honestly answer never, then the risk from that water is very low, especially if there could be a possibility of contamination in that water. If the answer is yes, then we've got to think about what we're growing, the quality of the water, and the timing of when we put that water on the crop. When we think about this, the type of commodity, something like leafy greens or berries, they're going to be more at risk if the water is contacting the fruit. Quality of the water, obviously, if the water is clean, there's no risk. But if the water could be carrying contamination, there is risk. And then the timing is important to consider as well. We know that contaminants, biological contaminants, do die off over time in the environment, primarily because they dry out or perhaps they're exposed to solar radiation, but they do die off over time. And so a longer period of time from a contamination situation to harvest, the less risk there is of a problem being there at harvest. So if we had a problem very early in the season and then we had a number of weeks or even months before harvest, that is a much lower risky situation than if we had a contamination event right at harvest. So these are things to consider. Now, a good risk management practice is to use only potable water close to harvest. So, if you have to use a surface source, for example, as you approach harvest, if you have the option to switch over to municipal water or a tested well, this is going to be much safer than using contaminated water close to harvest. What about washing produce? We'll talk more about this here in a moment, but whenever we wash produce, whenever we use water at harvest or post-harvest, it must be potable. It needs to be clean. Now, looking at this picture here, putting all of these apples into a bin and washing these apples, how long is that water going to stay clean? Well, that's a good question, and it's difficult to estimate that. But I will make a couple of statements. First of all, Using that water only once and not for multiple batches of apples is a good risk management practice. That way, if we have a few bad apples that introduce some contamination, we rinse the apples and wash that away. And it's not present because for the next batch of fruit because we use a fresh batch of water. What about using a sanitizer in the water? There are sanitizers that you can place in the water that will help eliminate any microorganisms that are free in the water. And this can be a good risk management practice as well. For more information on using sanitizers and water that's going to contact produce, please reach out or visit the Produce Safety Alliance website. Okay, what can we do to lower the safety risk? Well, first of all, let's always use a regulated treated water source that meets EPA drinking water standards whenever possible. We can use this for irrigation, for washing produce, for washing our hands, and for applying chemicals. In other words, potable water. If we intend to use another source, such as a well, have that well tested. Testing can be done here in Missouri in with the local health department. Very straightforward process. If you need information on that, reach out to your local health department or reach out to me and I can share information on that as well. And consider using drip irrigation in the garden. As we mentioned, that is the safest way to irrigate crops. Okay, our next topic is soil, manure, and compost. So anything that we can do to separate produce items from the soil, removing them from close contact with the soil is helpful from the standpoint of managing risk. And in these pictures, we see blackberries that are tied up to trellises, but any type of fruit or vegetable that we can support to keep the part we're going to harvest well off the ground is an important risk management practice. So thinking about things such as trellising cucumbers or trellising tomatoes, staking peppers, making sure that the part we're going to harvest doesn't contact the soil is helpful from the standpoint of managing risk. Now, why are we interested in separating harvested part from the soil? Well, because manure can carry risk. We know from research that human pathogens can survive in manure, sometimes for a year or even longer. Now, we don't know precisely how long these pathogens in manure will survive, but it's important to be very cautious from the standpoint of the possible contamination of produce with these organisms that might be present in the soil because of a manure application. Now, a helpful risk management practice, if you plan to use manure as a nutrient source, and I'm not trying to discourage you from using manure because manure carries huge benefits from the standpoint of nutrients, organic matter, conditioning in the soil, but we have to recognize that there is risk and we want to use this manure in a less risky fashion. But looking at the National Organic Program standards with a time interval between when you apply the manure to when you harvest a crop off of that field that was manured. High-risk crops, these would be crops like strawberries, leafy greens, vine crops that are on the ground, or root vegetables. Let's allow 120 days from the manure application to harvest. With lower risk crops, perhaps something like apples on a tree or blueberries or staked tomatoes, 90 days from manure application to harvest. So again, these are good standards to consider from the standpoint of managing the risk that might be present in a manure application. Now, we all know what manure is, right? But we have to recognize that other things such as manure teas, such as compost that has been contaminated with manure, compost that hasn't been properly composted, all of these can carry the same risk that manure carries. So again, 90 or 120 days is a good risk management practice if you choose to use any of these soil amendments. Now, is it manure or is it compost? If a manure has been properly composted, then it is considered to be microbially safe. The composting process reduces heat, and if done properly, the temperature in the pile reaches a high enough level that it eliminates harmful organisms. But in many cases, manure does not go through proper composting before it's used. And we have to treat it as if it were raw manure because it could still carry the risk of harmful microorganisms. So if we're going to use compost, let's make sure that it's really compost. Now, as I mentioned before, there are lots of things that fall under the category of manure: raw manure, aged manure, untreated manure slurries, compost teas made with raw manure. Any soil amendment that's not treated with a scientifically validated process can carry risk. So we have to recognize that. Now, what can we do to make compost safe? First of all, if we're doing plant-based compost only, without an addition of things such as manures in the raw materials, it's typically safer, generally safer than animal-based compost. Now, commercial compost, which is produced under standardized conditions, is generally safe as well. You can produce safe compost on farm or in the garden, but you have to recognize that it has to meet certain criteria to make sure that the pile was hot enough for a long enough period of time to eliminate microorganisms. And one of the problems we frequently see is, yes, the center of the pile may have reached a high enough temperature, but the outer edges of the pile did not. So if the pile is not regularly turned and the outer edge is incorporated into the middle, we can have a situation where the outside of the pile still can harbor microorganisms. So if you'd like some ideas on what safe compost, the conditions that would produce safe compost might look like. Static composting. Again, this is a static pile, aerobic, minimum of 131 degrees for 3 days, followed by curing with proper insulation. So in this case, we're actually putting an insulated layer over the compost pile to make sure that the whole pile reaches that 131 degrees for 3 days. Turn compost, where we turn the pile, again, a minimum of 131 degrees for 15 days, a minimum of 5 turnings, followed by curing with proper insulation. Now, if compost has been properly produced, it's considered to be microbially safe, and there's no restrictions in terms of the days between application and harvest for properly produced compost. Now, again, with certain crops like strawberries, leafy greens, it might be good to err on the side of caution. And again, when in using even properly produced compost, might be good to err on the side of caution with these particular crops. Now, where should we put the compost pile? We want to keep unfinished compost out of the garden, so let's place it as far from the garden or field as possible. Obviously, we want it in a convenient spot, but we don't want it in an area where it might accidentally contaminate a garden bed or a farm field. If possible, place it downhill and then watch out for compost contamination. We can have a beautiful pile of properly produced compost, but if we leave it open, it can be contaminated by animal activity, particularly feral cats and other things that could blow onto the pile. So it's a good practice. And you can see in this picture here, the pile in the center, the tarp has been rolled back to show us the pile, but there's a tarp in place over that pile to protect it from contamination. Okay, so what can we do to lower the safety risk? First of all, best practice is to put compost bins or piles as far away from the garden or the fields as possible. Assume that on-site composting that includes manures does not produce microbially safe compost. Let's treat this compost as if it were contaminated. Do not harvest at-risk produce within 120 days of an application of manure or on-site developed compost. And let's incorporate compost into the soil as soon as possible so that decomposition can start as quickly as possible so that we can see the benefits of that compost application. All right, our next topic is animals in the garden or field. So why are animals a problem? Well, it's well, I love animals, okay? Dogs are definitely my best friend, but I recognize that animals can cause problems if they end up in the garden or in a field. First of all, because they could deposit animal feces, and these feces have been traced back to a number of different types of foodborne illnesses. And the feeding of animals, the rubbing of animals against produce, all of these things can introduce contamination. Animals frequently have contamination present on their bodies. And again, a number of research studies have looked at things such as hair on animals, their mouths, their eyes, and various other parts of their anatomy. And oftentimes, these areas do carry contamination. So we want to be very conscious of the presence of animals on the farm. And so we're looking for evidence, certainly direct evidence such as manure or tracks, but we also want to look damage to crops that might indicate that animals were present. And I'll show you a picture here in a moment that is a prime example of that. And we have to recognize that it can be difficult or even impossible to keep animals out of a garden or a field. Birds fly, deer jump fences. Uh, Again, it can be difficult to keep animals out. We need to make a good faith effort, but we need to be very vigilant in examining crops, particularly as harvest approaches, so that we find any evidence or any cases of contamination, because it can be difficult to completely exclude animals. So again, we should do our best to do this. Things such as fencing, repellents, scarecrows, trapping, or lethal methods. These are all approaches that we can take to keep animals, to keep wildlife out of garden areas as much as possible. Well, what should we do if we do find evidence of contamination? So here's an example of where a dog got into a farm field, and thankfully the contamination wasn't actually in the crop, but it was adjacent to the crop, so we were concerned. Well, the first thing to do is to figure out if there's been any collateral contamination over and above what we physically see. So we want to examine the area around where we see contamination. And then if we feel that there could be a risk, then we want to establish what's called a no harvest buffer zone. Now, how big should that zone be? Well, only you can answer that. It's based upon the crop, whether or not it's rained since the problem occurred. Maybe someone stepped in it, or an implement drove through it. You know, just things that might imply or might show that the problem is spread beyond where we physically see it. Recommendation anywhere from 0 to 25 feet, depending upon the situation. And then we don't harvest crop within that area. Again, we know from research that once produce is contaminated with fecal matter, it is nearly impossible to clean it up. So we want to err on the side of caution when it comes to possible contamination from something that we see. So examining our crops and then establishing no harvest buffer zones if we see evidence of a problem. Very important from the standpoint of risk management. Some more thoughts. We need to keep domestic animals out of gardens and out of farm fields, and particularly from handling areas. So animals such as chickens, rabbits, also our pets, dogs, cats, and other pets. Probably the worst offender that I've seen is cats in areas where we handle produce after harvest. Cats on counters, cats on grading tables, cats in sinks. And again, cats like to jump up on top of things. And I mean, I love cats, but I don't love cats on surfaces where I'm going to be handling produce. So we need to make an effort to keep domestic animals and pets away from our produce. And then again, keep the compost bin or the compost pile covered. Okay, lowering the safety risk. First of all, let's try to keep animals out as much as we can. Let's keep animals that we have control over, domestic animals and pets, out of gardens and out of fields. Again, good faith effort. Let's prune back perches. Let's use repellents, various other things. And then let's definitely scout produce before harvest, looking for problems. And if we find problems, let's have a plan in place to address any issues. Okay, our final point that we're going to cover tonight is harvest and post-harvest. And this is a really, really important time to be focused on produce food safety, because we're taking all of the produce that we've put so much work into, and we're moving that produce into a condensed area, the area where we're going to sort out produce, perhaps wash it, perhaps grade it, perhaps pack it, perhaps put it into a cooler. We want to make sure that all of that effort we put into growing safe crops in the field doesn't get messed up by something that's going on at harvest or post-harvest. So some harvest considerations. Try to pick produce when it's dry. This is important from the standpoint of maintaining quality, but it's also important to recognize, for example, that if there's contamination on our hands, it's more quickly spread through a wet produce than it is through dry produce. Any produce that has bird droppings or manure visibly present must be discarded. This is contaminated, and it must not be used for fresh produce. And then if we see animal manure, as we saw in the earlier slide, and we feel there could be a problem around where we visibly saw the problem, we want to discard that produce as well. All water that we use as harvest and post-harvest must be potable. We want to make sure that we clean and sanitize harvest containers and tools daily. Make sure that the surfaces that we put produce on, so again, things such as our harvest buckets, any tables, coolers, containers that we might use to transport crops, these should be cleaned and sanitized as well. We want to deliver produce promptly or cool it quickly to maintain quality. And in the case of many microorganisms, once we cool it, this slows down the reproduction. And this can help, again, keep a small problem from becoming a larger problem. And then at this point, it is critically important that everyone understand proper hand washing and that we provide hand washing facilities. Here's the slide I promised to show you. Inspecting crops carefully before harvest and discarding any crop that is contaminated. This was a crop of peppers, and these were little lunchbox peppers. We did do an examination of the crop. We didn't see any evidence of poop around the peppers, but then as we started harvesting, we came upon an area where there were a number of fruit that looked like this. And what had happened is that mice had climbed up the pepper plants, chewed into the fruit, and were eating the seeds. Well, this is a contamination event. Wherever those mice were active, there's a strong likelihood that they contaminated that fruit. So any of the fruit that we found that had been damaged, we discard it. Again, because it's been contaminated and we cannot clean it up. Let's think about our harvest containers. Here's some examples of different types of harvest containers. If I had to make a general statement about picking containers, they should either be single use or they should be easily cleaned and sanitized. So if we look at these pictures, let's start at the upper left. Here are gardeners out harvesting produce into single-use boxes. And this is great, but these boxes should not be used for another round of harvesting because, first of all, they cannot be cleaned and sanitized. You cannot clean and sanitize cardboard. And secondly, again, they're meant to be single use. They're not intended to be used more than once because, again, almost invariably, there is going to be some damage to the container from the harvest process. The upper right, here we see food grade plastic bags used to harvest crops, an excellent container. These bags are clean, but again, they should not be reused. We shouldn't be collecting used plastic bags from general groceries and then use them for produce because there's a strong likelihood that a used plastic bag could carry contamination. Perhaps that bag had raw meat in it, perhaps it had something else that could contaminate it. So don't recycle bags and use them for harvesting produce. Now, looking at the lower right container, this is a plastic harvest tote. This is a container that is intended for harvesting produce. It's made out of plastic that is easily cleaned and sanitized. It has vent holes so that it can be used effectively in a cooler. Important to recognize that when cleaning and sanitizing these containers, you need to use a brush that can get down into the crevices. The middle picture, here we see food grade plastic 5-gallon buckets, another excellent harvest container, but it's important to keep these clean and sanitized. Now, how do we know if a container needs to be cleaned and sanitized? We use our eyes. If we see visible evidence of soil, we need to clean and sanitize it. It's a good practice to have a regular schedule in place, and then if we need to shorten the interval, well, let's do so. Lower right, a paper bag. Well, again, if it's the first use of a clean paper bag, that is just fine. But let's not recycle paper bags, just as let's not recycle plastic bags. What about packing and sorting areas? Well, portable is just fine. Those plastic tables that break down and that you can haul around, those are great. But make sure that you plan on surfaces that you can clean and sanitize. For example, a portable plastic table, very straightforward to clean and sanitize that. But a portable wooden table, perhaps not so, especially as it is gouged and scarred and has wear on it. You develop lots of places on that table where bacteria can lodge. It can be very difficult to adequately clean and sanitize that damaged surface. What about permanent packing and sorting areas? Well, first of all, again, if we're trying to pack and sort in an open area, that's fine, but let's see if we can do it in such a way that we reduce the risk. Enclosed structures are always better, but an open structure will work. But let's do our best to keep rodents and birds and insects, pets, and unauthorized people out of the area where we're handling produce. And again, we want to pay special attention to surfaces that contact produce. Make sure, as we're putting our farm together, that we choose surfaces that are easy to clean and sanitize. Hard surfaces such as stainless steel or hard, smooth plastic. Now, we need to talk a little bit about cleaning and sanitizing. I've mentioned those words, and you might think that they're synonymous, but they are not. Cleaning and sanitizing is a process. The first part of that process is cleaning. Cleaning is followed by sanitizing. They need to occur in that order. Now, how do we clean a surface, a tool, or a container? Well, first of all, we remove visible soil. We then wet and then we scrub the affected area with detergent and potable water. Keep in mind at this point, all water that we're going to be using is drinking water quality, but we need to wash it and scrub it. There needs to be physical activity with a brush or some other tool to dislodge what are called biofilms. And biofilms are sticky layers that are present on the surface of food contact surfaces. And bacteria lodge in these surfaces, and they can be very difficult to remove without physical activity and detergent. Once that's done, then we rinse the area with potable water. And then if we choose to sanitize, then we apply the sanitizer. There are a number of different sanitizers that can be used. Food grade bleach is a good example as long as it's on the label. Make sure that you check the label to see if it is labeled for use on food contact surfaces. But there are other sanitizers that can be used as well. And if you'd like more information on sanitizer use for food contact surfaces, again, please reach out or check out the Produce Safety Alliance website. Now, storage. We need to have secure places to store our tools, harvest containers, bags, work gloves, and other items. It can be very difficult to keep these items in a clean state if rodents can get into the areas where they're stored. So make sure that we have secure places. As I mentioned earlier, do not store chemicals of any type with tools or harvest containers. And if you have a cooler, it needs to be secure. It needs to be such that you can exclude pests, vermin, such as rodents, from cold storage. Now, what about produce that's been damaged? It's been dropped, punctured, or bruised. Well, frequently damaged produce, these damaged areas provide entry points for pathogens. Now, they may or they may not be contaminated, but it can be a risk management practice not to send out for consumption produce that has been damaged, punctured, or bruised. And again, proper harvesting and culling is important for produce safety and also, of course, for quality as well. What about transport? What about moving produce? So again, if we're going to use some sort of transport like this wheelbarrow or perhaps a pickup truck or a wagon that could be contaminated, we want to make sure that that vehicle, that wagon, that wheelbarrow has been cleaned and sanitized. This is especially the case if we've used it to haul manure or soil amendments or animal products or anything else that could have caused contamination. These need to be cleaned because they, in essence, become food contact surfaces. Now, what about washing produce? Well, if you choose to wash produce, recognize that potable water only. It has to be drinking water, quality water at this point. But recognize that you don't have to wash produce. There are no regulations that say you have to wash produce. So if you don't have to wash it, don't wash it. Now, again, you can wash at the garden if you choose to, but make sure that the surfaces or equipment that you're using can be cleaned and sanitized. Now, if you're taking produce somewhere, if you don't wash it, it's helpful to let the person know that, where you're delivering it, that it hasn't been washed. But recognize that you are not required to wash produce. So keep in mind that if you do choose to wash it, potable water only. Okay, what can we do to lower the safety risk? Well, we can certainly wear single-use gloves as long as we don't get them contaminated. Make sure that we wash hands before harvesting and when contaminated. Make sure that we scout the garden or the field carefully before harvesting to look for any manure risk. Make sure that our work surfaces, tools, and equipment are regularly cleaned and sanitized. And make sure that anything we transport produce in is clean as well. Okay, so those are the points I wanted to talk about today. There is so much more that we could discuss, but this is a good starting point from the standpoint of developing that food safety culture that I mentioned at the beginning. For more information, here are some resources. The Produce Safety Alliance, as I mentioned several times, has developed a number of useful resources on their website. The North Carolina State University Food Safety and Community Gardens website, very helpful. Kansas State University has developed a very useful produce safety website, and it's here as well. I do want to mention some opportunities for a more in-depth produce food safety training. The Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Alliance training, boy, that is a mouthful, is an 8-hour training that goes very much into produce safety. It's a deep dive into everything related to growing and handling safe produce. And we have 2 of these currently scheduled. January 23rd in El Dorado Springs, we have an in-person training scheduled. And then on February 5th and 8th, we have a remote delivery training scheduled. That's an online training scheduled. And you can register for either of these at the website that's listed here. I'll also mention GAP's third-party audits. This is a produce food safety audit done by a third party. It is a voluntary audit. In fact, we had a workshop on this in November. The recording is available on the Springfield Community Gardens YouTube channel site. And if you're interested in a third-party audit, then the Missouri Department of Agriculture welcomes questions related to that. They do the audits here in Missouri. More details on third-party audits in that recording that I just mentioned. And with that, that concludes the prepared materials. And again, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. At least for me, it demonstrates that you are interested in these issues related to safe produce and that you're interested in developing that culture of food safety that I mentioned at the very beginning. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and discontinue sharing.
Thank you, Patrick. And we did have one partially answered question, just to remind everyone, going back to the pest question. We have someone who has mice in their garden eating the broccoli heads and leaving droppings, and we know that mice travel all over. So could you just repeat for us the range of the area that should be considered contaminated?
Well, again, it depends upon the characteristics of the incident. And in the case of mice, we're dealing with a small, discrete dropping. It's not like, a cow pie or something like that. But we are dealing with a situation where they can distribute those droppings widely. So it's important to take a look at where they are visibly present, their activities visibly present. Take a good look for manure evidence and then make your decision accordingly. I would assume that it would be a very small no harvest zone from the standpoint of where you visibly see damage, but it's impossible to say exactly what it should be. The regulations require farmers to use common sense. And so mice, I don't see as a major risk from the standpoint of the spread of manure, that sort of thing. But, any crop that has been visibly chewed on by the mice should not be moving into channels where it might be consumed fresh. Now, could you use it yourself by cooking it? That would likely eliminate any risk of contamination, but you wouldn't want to use that broccoli in a fresh salad.
Thank you very much. And I think that that concludes it for this evening. Thank you again. And as Patrick has echoed, I just want to definitely reiterate, like, we are very available to continue answering your questions. So thank you for being here and definitely have a safe and happy holiday.
Thank you, everyone.